Hi, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. I'm the host of this podcast and where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today is Todd Moss, the executive director of the Energy for Growth Hub. Todd, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Uh, Todd, we have a tradition. I have a tradition. I'm using the papal we this morning, I guess, that guests introduce themselves. I know you're the executive director of Energy for Growth Hub. You've been in DC in politics for a long time, but uh, assume you have just arrived at an event, a dinner party, say, and you have 30 or 45 seconds to introduce yourself. Go.
All right. So, look, I'm a lifelong Africa policy junkie. A couple days after I graduated college, I got on a plane and went to Zimbabwe. Spent about a year backpacking around Africa, was completely hooked. And then I was bouncing between London and Washington, D.C. for most of my career. And for more than the last decade, I've been in Washington, working first for the World Bank, then for the Center for Global Development. Then I worked for the State Department as Condoleezza Rice's senior West Africa diplomat. And for the last 2 years, I've been running the Energy for Growth Hub, which is a nonprofit global network dedicated to building a high energy future for everyone. So that's me.
That's good. I didn't time it, but 46 or so, I don't know, 47 seconds. So you covered a lot of ground there. Um, Good. Well, so you've explained Energy for Growth Hub succinctly. Why are there no low energy, high income countries?
Well, if we think about everything, and first of all, Robert, thank you for putting that quote as the opening to your book. I thought that was terrific. Look, if we look historically, there are no examples of countries becoming rich without consuming a ton more energy. Even if we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, a lot of it was, because of the steam engine and coal. And that's just held true forever. For us to become more wealthy and more productive, we have to use a lot of energy to do so, and there's just no escaping that. And that's why even today, the poor countries of the world just consume very little energy, and every single rich country consumes a lot of energy. And it's built into everything. So we think about it as lights, right? We think about it as lighting, maybe charging our phone, running our laptops, but actually most of the energy and the electricity that we consume is actually out there, invisible, out in the wider economy, in the data centers. It's embedded in everything that we use. It's behind everything, and we don't really even notice it until it's out. Like, think of the panic that happens when the power goes out, even for an hour, much less for days or weeks. We would not be able to function in a normal way, and our economy would grind to a halt. And that's effectively what's happening in a lot of low energy contexts, is that the economy that should be churning out jobs and creative ideas and higher incomes, it's not, because it's being killed in part by lots of things, but one of them is a lack of reliable, affordable energy.
Well, but let me follow up on that because you stated that case very well, and I've written about this. There are a lot of people have written about it, but energy is a broad term,
Sure.
and I've focused on electricity, and much of your work lately has been on electricity as well. So let's segregate those out if you don't mind. So
Hmm.
um, there's been a big body of work. What was his name? The Cal Berkeley, his last name was Kurt Smith. Looked at smoke inhalation in India and other countries, and correlated that with mortality among women and girls. So let's break it up into and I want to talk about industrial use of energy versus
Yeah.
residential, because that's one of your key areas that I think is quite interesting. But let's just look at the home for a moment and talk about cooking fuels and electricity. So what we need more energy, but why do women need more and better cooking fuel?
So yeah, so you're right. In every context in the home, we need more than just. We don't actually care. That's the thing. We don't care um, in a practical sense where we get the electrons from, right? So I actually could take a hot shower, and it doesn't, I don't even need to know if it's a gas heater or electric heater. It doesn't matter. I don't need to know where it comes from. Same with now with vehicles. You can get in a car and drive somewhere, and it doesn't really matter if it's gas or diesel or electricity. Um, we care about the services that
yeah, that's
energy,
it. We care about the
we
service,
care about the
not the
services
source of the
energy can provide.
right.
Yeah. But I do think in the among the residential energy services we need, cooking is so fundamental. I mean, eating is, it's obviously fundamental to life, but also food is just so much a part of everyone's culture. I probably think about food about 100 times a day. It's just so embedded in who we are as people and who are what our societies are. And it also happens to consume a lot of the energy that we use in a normal day, happens to be in cooking and food production. And in poor contexts, people use really inefficient, really dirty fuels. And there are, you mentioned India, large parts of Africa, people are still using biofuel. They're burning wood or charcoal inside their home to cook. And that obviously very inefficient. It's a very inefficient use of women's time to go collect this stuff. But it also creates all kinds of indoor health issues. You would never, you or I would never think of cooking on a wood stove inside a house without proper ventilation. You would just never do that. But a lot of people, unfortunately,
but this is common
it's the reality that people
in
live with.
in developing countries. If I can just interrupt you there, because as you're saying this, I remember vividly. It was a few years ago. It was Anderson Cooper who was in Congo and near Virunga National Park, talking about the issue of deforestation and the protection of the gorillas in the park.
Sure.
And I remember he was interviewing, I think it was a German conservation guy, and he said, "Well, how do we solve this?" And I recall vividly the guy saying, "You give me enough butane stoves, and I'll solve this tomorrow." Right. So it's not that issue of availability of energy goes beyond the human aspects, which are incredibly important, but it's also about the preservation of wildlands in Africa. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, well, sure. And I mean, this is the thing, is that every energy source has some kind of trade-off. And I think that we should just be, we should be honest about what those trade-offs are. Nothing comes at no cost. And we want to try to balance off those trade-offs and deliver energy in the most efficient, cost-effective manner to get people the services that they need, to allow people to live better lives and allow poor people to become richer so that their children can live better lives than they did. But every source, even, pick your favorite, it has some kind of cost associated with it, needs to be managed.
So now let's talk about electricity, and I'll ask this question specifically: why does electricity matter so much for women and girls?
Um, I the short answer is I don't really know. I can speculate, of course, that a lot of it has to do with labor roles and the use of time and time efficiency. And we certainly saw in the United States, and there's actually a wonderful little TED talk by Hans Rosling called "The Magic Washing Machine," about it.
Sure,
I think about his grandmother.
I'm familiar with this. Where his grandmother came over to watch his mother wash clothes in their new washing machine for the first
Exactly.
time, and she sat in front of it for the entire cycle because she was so
Exactly.
excited about that revolution in clothes washing.
Right. So stories like that, and people may know, I remember, my grandmother talking about the first time they got a television and the first vacuum cleaner in their house. So these kinds of stories resonate with people where they can relate to them from their own lives and see that modern electricity can help deliver modern appliances, which make our lives much more efficient and allow us to do other things. And I think probably because of the gender labor division, that's had a disproportionately positive effect on women.
And that's true in Africa. It's true all around the world. So, what are the? Well, let me step back because I'm just curious. I know that you worked as a deputy assistant secretary of state. And I know you've written some spy novels that feed on or follow on some of your history in the diplomatic corps. So you worked with Condoleezza Rice. Well, I just, we're going to come back and talk about energy. What was that like?
Okay.
What was the State Department? What is that experience like for you?
Well, look, first of all, I wound up in that position through a series of complete accidents that I could never have planned in a million years. So sometimes life throws the biggest lessons is sometimes life throws random things at you, and you just got to roll with it. But seeing our government work from the inside was both intensely frustrating and intensely enlightening. Our government has incredible capacity to do lots of things. It can be very influential. It can rally resources, unlike very few institutions in the world. But it's also such a big behemoth that it's not set up to operate very efficiently. And so I found myself in a position of, I was what was I, 38 at the time, and being able to meet with heads of state and represent my government and my country, incredibly lucky and powerful thing to be able to do. At the same time, I found that day to day, most of my time was spent kind of infighting and bickering with other parts of the State Department or other federal agencies about how the United States should respond and how we should balance trade-offs. Come back to our theme here, that balancing trade-offs is what policymaking is really all about, and that was a big lesson I learned.
What's the most important skill for a diplomat?
Most important skill for a diplomat. Well, you would think it would be able. You would think that it would be able to lie with a straight face, but I actually don't think that's true. So an effective diplomat,
lie with a straight face.
Yeah, an effective diplomat needs to be able to work with our allies to help try to solve common problems. So we're not going to, an American official and a Nigerian official are not going to look at a particular problem, democracy, coronavirus, counterterrorism. We're not going to look at that problem in the same way, but we have mutual interest in solving those problems together and trying to find that common ground and have practical steps that we can take together and do that in a respectful way. And I think maybe it's particularly sensitive working in Africa, where most African officials have had decades of Westerners telling them what to do, and that just is not work. That does not work in this world. You have to. It has to be built a relationship on mutual respect and mutual interests, and that I think is the most important skill for an American diplomat for the next decade.
So if I'm hearing you right, if I repeat that back, the most important skill is humility.
Yes.
Is that a common commodity in Washington, D.C.?
I think the last 4 years have been chastening for a lot of people. And I think if you're an American diplomat and you were assigned to go out and rebuild a relationship with an important ally right now, I think humility is probably what you should be wearing on your shirt sleeve right now.
So I heard one guy in politics, this was in the Texas State House a long time ago, there are no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, but there are permanent interests. So is that true?
I think even our interests shift over time. But I do think that we have some fundamental values and some fundamental interests that the United States is always going to want to pursue. And these are going to be complicated, and it's not, single issue advocacy. It can be very powerful domestically, but when you're trying to balance complicated relationships, it can be pretty difficult. And that, it doesn't matter what the issue is, but trying to see the big picture, I think, is vitally important, because that's what politicians are trying to balance.
Well, so let me just last question on that, because
sure.
We've seen this the 4 years of the Trump presidency, where a lot of American interests were, let's say, shifted or blurred? Um, is it going to, can those, how long will it take to repair those relationships? I mean, what was your view? I mean, looking back, I know there was a lot of unrest in the State Department in particular. I mean, what, if you could summarize what you think, was there damage, permanent damage in America's foreign relationships under the Trump administration? And if so, how does that going to play out in the next few years?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that it's remotely controversial to say that America's standing in the world took a very serious and lasting blow from the last 4 years. Withdrawing from the WHO, I'm eyes wide open on problems of UN agencies, but withdrawing from the WHO was just such a terrible signal during a pandemic. And that's just one among many examples. So some of that damage can be quickly repaired. We can rejoin the WHO. We can rebuild some of the relationships that were strained. The damage within the State Department is going to take a little bit longer. A lot of highly qualified people left. Morale inside the building was terrible. Not just the State Department, but some of our other federal agencies. And that I think will be slower to recover. And I think we will see if there's permanent damage to our standing vis-a-vis other regions that have increased their influence in the vacuum that we created, and most obviously China. But there are lots of countries that were very glad to see the United States step back from the world and become inward looking, and they took advantage of that very aggressively. And I don't know how long it's going to take for us to get that back, or if we ever will.
Okay, so let's go back. Thanks. So, I mean, I don't know many people who've worked at that level of the State Department, and so those are things that, as I was reading, preparing for this, I thought, yeah, those are things I'm quite interested in. But let's go back to energy. What is the modern energy? What is the modern energy minimum?
Modern energy minimum. Okay, so there's a wonderful goal that we have for the world. It's sustainable goal number 7, which is to provide reliable, affordable, sustainable, modern energy for every person on the planet by 2030. It's a wonderful goal. We absolutely should do everything we can to achieve that. The problem is that the way we are measuring success is by basic household electricity. So they're looking at the rate of residences, the rate of people that live in a home that has some kind of modern electricity, and they set the bar at 50 kilowatt hours per person per year, and that's the minimum. Now that is,
and just to be clear, so the global average is about 4,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. Right?
Probably something around there. In the United States, it's 13,000.
12 or 13,000, right.
And there is no country, there's no wealthy country in the world where it's less than like 3,000 or 4,000.
Right.
But we've set the bar at 50 for the world to define that.
Here, this is an IEA number, International Energy Agency number. Is that not right?
It is. It's an IEA definition of what they consider the minimum consumption for somebody to have modern access.
To be considered having energy access.
Correct.
Right.
And while that's 50 kilowatt hours of electricity is better than zero, it's still very, obviously extremely small. It's enough for a couple of light bulbs, and maybe you can charge your cell phone, but not much else. And so what we thought is, okay, that's fine as kind of the equivalent of an extreme energy poverty line. Let's get everybody to 50, but let's define the next step. And we have a parallel in income. There's a global goal to get everyone above $1.90 a day in income, and we absolutely should get everyone above that. But nobody thinks that $1.90 a day is enough income for a human being to live on in the 21st century. We all want people to go from $1.90 a day to $5 a day, and then into the middle class. And eventually, ideally, everyone in the world is prosperous and wealthy. And so we gathered 14 leading thinkers in development and energy to come around to think about, okay, if 50 kilowatt hours is just the first step, what's the next step that we would want to try to measure? Because the old adage, what gets measured gets done. That's what we're hoping to do. So we came up with this idea of a modern energy minimum. And it's better than, it's an additional metric for measuring SDG 7. And it's better than the current measure in two fundamental ways. One, it's a lot bigger. It's not 50, it's actually 1,000 kilowatt hours per person. And it's not just electricity at home, because 3/4 of the electricity we consume is actually outside the home. So we've set it at a 30-70 split, which is roughly the global average, where we want to start measuring people that use 300 at home and an average of 700 in the wider economy, in data centers, in hospitals, and
so on
public
average
services.
in a given country, that average would be 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. That would be
Correct.
the new target. Well, so I read your paper on this, and I thought, well, that's interesting. But even still, what's interesting about this idea of that modern energy minimum is that 1,000 kilowatt hours is, as you know, if you've seen my new book, that is about an average for an American refrigerator. And I stole that idea directly from you, and I credited you of the refrigerator as a metric. But to be clear, that's still a very, relative to American standards and relative to the global average, even at 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year, we're still talking about a relatively low rate of consumption.
It is, and we're again not saying that this is the end goal. It's the next step. We'll go get people from 0 to 50. Now let's get them from 50 to 1,000. And what we did also to come up with the 1,000, it's a nice round number, but it's not random. It's not totally random. We took all data that we could find for every country going back to 1980, which is about how far back we could get decent global coverage. And we correlated income and electricity consumption. And it's very tightly correlated for the energy nerds or data nerds out there. The correlation, the R squared is 0.77, which is incredibly tight for this kind of thing. And 1,000 kilowatt hours is strongly associated with about $2,500 a year in income. So it's almost $7 a day. So again, it's better than $2 a day, but we're almost getting people into the lower middle class globally. And obviously we want people to keep going higher, but it's that next step we want to track.
Sure. So how does that then relate back to Africa? Because you identified yourself as a Africa devotee, Africa nerd,
junkie.
Sorry, that was it. I forgot that. What would that mean then for Africa? As the number that I recall off the top of my head is that there are 1.1 billion Africans now, 1.2 billion Africans. They use about as much electricity, roughly, as 33 million Canadians, right? They're starting from an extraordinarily low base.
Yeah.
So what would that 1,000, I don't know that per capita number in Africa, what is that number in Africa now? Do you know that for the continent as a whole?
Yeah, so I don't have the number right. So there's a very important caveat when you think of Africa. So Africa, actually, it's over 1 billion people, incredibly diverse. The thing that they have in common is that they're on a contiguous geographic space, which is random. But when you're thinking about the energy future and the energy needs, you first want to take out South Africa. South Africa's consumption is over 4,000 per kilowatt hour, and it's almost all coal. And it goes back because they've had decades and decades of very heavy mining industry. In the rest of the continent, nobody's even close to 4,000, and almost nobody uses coal. So a regional aggregate is very, very misleading if you include South Africa.
Gotcha.
It also can be very misleading if you include Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and the rest of North Africa, because they're also significantly wealthier than the rest of Africa, and they're also extremely heavy on gas. So when you see, and the Department of Energy has done it, there was just a study that came out in Nature Energy in the last couple of days. They took Africa as a whole and said, oh, look at all of these fossil fuels. Look at all this coal and gas that's driving Africa's future. It's actually not true. If you disaggregate South Africa and North Africa, the rest of Africa is incredibly intensive in renewable energy. And it's also, people are consuming at a much, much lower rate. So what I like to do is disaggregate the countries. If we think of Africa's largest country, Nigeria, over 200 million people, it will be bigger than the United States in the next 2 decades. Electricity consumption per capita is 150, and that includes everything.
And this is despite decades of electrification efforts, and I want to talk about corruption in a moment. But
sure.
Nigeria seems to be the country that, in the history of electrification in Africa, has had the least in growing electrification. It's the biggest economy, the huge mineral wealth, and yet they've gone nowhere. So I guess I'll ask that question now. Why?
Okay.
I mean, why is this country that has had, and I have my own opinions, but why is Nigeria unable to increase their electricity use in any meaningful way?
Well, look, we could have an entire podcast about the issues that Nigeria is facing.
Or 3
look,
or 4.
Nigeria is, Nigeria is one of the most incredible places in both a positive and in a frustratingly negative way. It has incredible talent and human capacity. If you just look at the success and capabilities of the Nigerian diaspora, just in the United States, just in Texas, look at the Nigerians in metropolitan Houston and all of the incredible things they're doing in medicine and science and business, and how many of their countrymen back in Nigeria are having that potential wasted because the courts don't work and the electricity doesn't work. It's really tragic. So the question is, what small things could be done to unlock some of that potential? And Nigeria has not gotten some of those basic things right yet. The biggest one is that the cost of electricity is, the price of electricity is below the cost of production. And that's done for political reasons, but what that means is there's no incentive to invest in the sector because you're going to lose money on every kilowatt hour that you sell. And until some of those structural issues get resolved, there's technical issues about the grid and their generation mix and all kinds of things like that as well. But until these basic issues get resolved, I don't think we're going to see Nigerian power sector really take off. So that, at its heart, that it's a governance failure there in that sector.
Well, is it okay? So let me ask that question then directly. A governance failure, are you saying corruption? Because when I look at some of the much of the history of the Nigerian efforts to increase their hydropower production, the different regimes that have been in place, and billions of dollars in loans were made and nothing happened. So maybe just broaden it out. How much of an impediment is corruption to electrification?
Well, look, corruption is a symptom, not a root cause, right? It's a symptom of a governance structure that's not functioning. It's not transparent. They're not getting the competitive market signals that you should have. There are a lot of countries that have corruption, that have politicians taking bribes for deals and are still getting things done. So I'm not saying that that's not a problem in Nigeria. It absolutely is. It is a problem in our own country. But solving corruption is not a strategy for us to get the power sector going. The strategy for getting the power sector going is getting the regulatory steps in place so that people can get a return on their investment, getting contract transparency, getting market mechanisms like solar auctions, getting those functioning, and getting the enabling infrastructure in place to allow those positive dynamics to start to evolve. We haven't seen that in Nigeria. And if we start with the idea, well, we've got to squeeze out corrupt politicians, we're chasing the symptoms rather than the root cause. And I think so. I want to be a little sort of cautious about overselling that as the problem. It's another symptom of the structural issues that the sector is facing.
Okay, well, so then what? Well, let me talk about those structural challenges, because those are the sanctity of contracts, property rights, all these
Yes.
things that we take for granted. My abbreviation would be civil society, right? It's an system that works, where people, or as I call it in Question of Power, esprit de grid, that there's some integrity. The system has integrity, but that integrity can't be imposed from the outside, right? It has to come from within the people that in those countries. And how does that get fostered from the outside, or can it be?
Yeah. So look, so it's not an either or. Clearly, the most powerful force in Nigeria are domestic taxpayers, right? If you're a domestic taxpayer, you should demand accountability for public resources. And we've actually seen tremendous strides, including in Nigeria, actually, especially in Nigeria, on budget reforms. And a large part of that came about through some very simple transparency mechanisms. The government started publishing the budget and started releasing information about what money was coming in and where it was going. That had a very powerful effect. It wasn't perfect, of course, but had a very powerful and positive effect. And that came about partially because of domestic pressure, but also that there was an international norm that people were saying, look, the expectation is you should be open about your fiscal policy. A very similar dynamic exists in the power sector. You need electricity consumers, investors, local business demanding that the power system get fixed. But there's also a role for international investors and groups like the World Bank to insist that Nigeria use international norms for competitive bidding, for transparency of contracts, for all of those things. Because we know when contracts and decisions get made behind closed doors, out of the view of the public, that nonsense happens. And when you do it and there's an international expectation, especially when there's international investors involved, that helps to bring some of those, it helps to provide momentum for the domestic pressure for governance reforms.
I see. So having those well, this is how everybody else is doing it. You need to do it this way, or you get no money from the multilateral or bilateral lenders then.
Well, it's not just about conditions on the lenders. If you were a large American corporation and you were going to go do a deal in Nigeria, you would want to insist on certain basic corporate governance standards. You'd want to make sure that the contracts you were signing were going to be legally valid in US or UK courts. And you'd want to know also that you're not competing against, let's say, a Russian company that's already signed a deal on the same land to provide the same service, but they've done something else in the deal that's undercutting you, right? So it's really the competitive pressures that I think make a much greater impact than the World Bank telling people, if you want a loan, you have to do this. That kind of conditionality, it seems like it works, but it actually doesn't work.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about fuels. What you mentioned coal and gas before. What fuels, what sources of generation are going to be the biggest, the most important ones in Africa over the next 2 or 3 decades?
Geez, that's such a great question. And the answer, you're probably going to be disappointed, but it really is going to differ market to market, right? So every country has their own endowments.
Fuel depends on geography.
Their own resources. Exactly. So like Kenya, we've talked a little bit about Kenya. So Kenya is more than 50 million people. It's bigger than the state of California in population. But Californians use more electricity playing video games than Kenyans use in their entire economy. That's the scale of the disparities we're facing. But in Kenya, their future is going to be mostly geothermal. They happen to be on top of the Rift Valley. It's a volcano structure, and they've got I think about 7 gigawatts of untapped, at least 7 gigawatts of untapped geothermal power. They're only tapping a fraction of that so far. They're very lucky. They're also Africa's biggest wind market right now. So I think that Kenya will be, all countries will have a balance, but they'll be mostly geothermal with a little bit of wind and solar, and probably some gas to fill in the gaps. A country like Nigeria or Ghana in West Africa, or Senegal in West Africa, they have a lot of domestic gas. Their future is going to be probably majority gas with some solar mixed in there. And then you've got countries like Ethiopia, which are betting big on big hydro. And so you are seeing, just like you'd expect in Europe or Asia, you're seeing countries respond to the choices that they have, and they'll look at the market prices and try to figure out what kind of mix will work best for them. I do think the big challenge in Africa is that the solar potential is huge, obviously, right? We think of Africa as a hot, sunny place, and most of it is. So you want to exploit low-cost solar as much as possible because of the prices, but you need to put that within the context of how do you provide 24/7 low-cost, reliable power, not just for households, to get back to our original thing, not just for lights at home, but for data centers, for industry, for big cities. I think a lot of people think of Africa as mostly people living in small villages in the middle of nowhere, and that's just not the case. The majority of Africans in the next decade will be living in cities, and Africa, like Asia, will be home to lots of big cities, greater than 10 million people. And those people are going to be living in close quarters, very dense, and they're going to live energy intensive lives. They're going to need power systems to support all of those jobs and all of those modern lifestyles.
Well, let me follow up on that, because that's one part of the work that you've done that I think is really among the most interesting things, which is your point that it's industrial level electric generation that drives broader electrification. That if you think about, we're going to wire neighborhoods first, well, maybe that's not the most efficient use of capital. Is that a fair assessment of what that if you want to begin electrification and broader scale electrification, you need to have industry that can use that power and then provide jobs, and then the residential can follow? Is that an approximation of what your work has found?
So yes and no, right?
Okay,
Yes and no. So there's kind of a small. So the small answer is that if you want to have if you want to build a power plant, to make that project bankable, you need a credible off-taker, somebody who is creditworthy, who can sign a 20-year contract to take the electricity. If you don't have that, it's very hard to build a plant. In Africa, because in almost every country, the utilities themselves are broke because they charge less than it costs to produce the electricity. They're not, in the US, the utility would be the off-taker. In Africa, it's not there. You actually need either a sovereign guarantor, or you need a large industrial customer, like an aluminum smelter or a mine. And then you can build the plant on the back of that long-term contract with that industrial customer, and then have residential electricity as a kind of side benefit. So that's the contract piece. The kind of bigger socioeconomic piece is that for people to afford electricity at home, and more importantly, to afford the appliances to run electricity at home, they actually need a job, and they need higher income. And that's going to come about from electricity for industry and commerce. Electrifying poor people at home is a good thing to do, so they have basic lighting and maybe basic refrigeration, but it's not going to drive poor people are not buying laptop computers, and they're not buying high energy appliances without that higher income. So there's a little bit of a sequence there.
Right. So this is the bi-directional nature of electricity in the economy, that
exactly
that economic growth drives electric demand, and electric demand drives growth. But it's the pattern that we saw in the New Deal era in the United States, right?
That's right.
There was a lot of electrification in rural areas, but then the Farm and Home Administration then began financing washing machines so that women could use that and use more electricity that made then the power plants more economic, right? Is
That's
that
right.
okay?
That's right. But there's a 21st century twist here, which is good
Okay.
news.
All
Okay.
right.
The good news is that in the past, rural homes would have to wait for the whole entire system to get built and eventually for the grid to arrive. And many Africans live within spitting range of the grid, and that is how they will get electricity at home. But many do not. And the 21st century spin here is that we now do have off-grid systems that are not the same as a grid connection, but it can still offer basic services so that people who are not getting the grid anytime soon can get some basic electricity services now.
So
Um,
you're talking about solar and batteries, solar and
we're
storage.
talking or look, diesel generators, right?
Right. Well,
Or
this is yeah, and that's
any
the great.
off-grid system. So when I was a student in Southern Africa, the homes that we used to stay in rural parts of Zimbabwe, they all had car batteries in their house, and they would use car batteries to run a radio. And in a weird way, that's an off-grid system, right?
Right.
So we now have solar. We have solar diesel hybrids, solar battery hybrids, and these are getting better and cheaper all the time, and they can deliver more services. And that, I think, will keep moving up it will keep delivering more and more to the consumer at that level. We're still not going to see those types of systems running, a steel mill anytime soon. So you're still going to need the grid for cities and industrial zones and for certain applications. But in the meantime, rural low-income people do not have to wait for the grid. They can still use these other off-grid systems until either they move to the city or the technology evolves so that they have higher use. So this is actually, to come back to your original question about the SDGs and the modern energy minimum. This is one of the tricks that the UN is getting away with, the idea of delivering solar lanterns or very small systems and saying that we're succeeding in delivering access because they've defined it down so low. And some of these solar home systems are fantastic. Some of them can even run small televisions. Some of them are very cheap, but almost none of them can boil water, for instance.
Right.
So they're not really delivering, they're delivering basic low-cost services in a way that nobody else can really compete. But it's not delivering the full suite of energy services that a modern economy needs.
But
So
it's not.
it's an important niche, but it's not the whole thing.
Right, but it's not transformative. And Priscilla Atanza, who it was a former colleague, and she's in our film Juice: How
Yeah,
Electricity Explains the World, and she has that great line in the film. She says, people aren't going to eat solar lamps, right? That's making the point
yeah,
that this is not enough.
yeah.
And but let me follow up on that, because there's something else that I have been totally ripped you off on and credited you, but it's your
I love
graph.
it when people do that. That's
Yeah,
great.
well, it's amateurs borrow, professional steal. Um, you made a graphic now several years ago when you were at the Center for Global Development, showing the disparity in a fixed amount of money. I believe it was $10 billion. You had $10 billion to spend on electrification. How many more people would gain access to electricity with a gas-fired generator versus solely spending that money on renewables? Can you walk me through that again? Because I've actually redrawn that graphic and occasionally use it in my presentations.
Yeah. So that was a couple of years ago, and it was part of a debate that there was a U.S. agency that was deciding how to deploy its capital to get the biggest bang for its buck.
It was the
And
Overseas Private Investment Corporation.
yeah, right, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now the Development Finance Corporation. It's been
Okay.
blown up bigger and better. But
Okay.
at the time, the old OPIC was trying to decide, whether they should have a rule to force renewables only, or should they carry on with gas. At the time, there were a couple of reasons that gas was more economical on average. And that was because they were able to crowd in a lot more private capital with gas. And of course, gas has a higher capacity factor, right? You can run a gas plant a lot more, a lot more hours in the day than a solar plant would provide. So I don't know what those ratios would look like today, because solar has come down a lot. At least the cost of panels has come down a lot. But I think us having a theoretical debate about whether wind or solar or nuclear is cheaper is kind of it's often irrelevant, because we're not comparing apples to apples. We're actually trying to compare equivalent services. And so this is like a little nerdy beef with the levelized cost of electricity, is that you really can't compare those across technologies that are providing entirely different services. And the analogy I like to make is to transportation. Okay, so we would not argue, I'll tell you that my bicycle is really cheap. It's very clean. It's the most efficient way for me to get around my neighborhood. And gosh, it's fun. I love my bicycle. Okay. But it is completely,
and you're not going to ride it to Kansas City.
Right. And it's completely useless for long haul trucking or to go visit my son in California, right? Completely useless. But for me to argue that my bicycle is cheaper than an 18-wheeler, or my bicycle is cheaper than an airplane, it doesn't make sense, because we're not talking about equivalent services. I want a bicycle for certain things. It's definitely the best solution for certain things. And I need a truck and an airplane for certain things. And so we need to, all countries and all societies need energy systems that deliver all of these things that they need, and kind of fighting over which one's cheaper than the other, I think, is kind of pointless.
So when it comes to, well, what kind of generation is going to work best in Africa, the answer is, well, it depends on where you are.
It depends. It depends per kilowatt, and it depends for what, right?
But this is true, of course, around the world. And as you know, Iceland has lots of geothermal and lots of hydro, so they can have a zero carbon grid. But that's
correct.
Not only 300,000 people live in Iceland. So which countries in Africa then are making the most progress? Where do you see the most progress in terms of electrification now? Where, and I guess I'm asking the different way to state that question is, where are the governance systems strong enough that they can support major increments of new generation capacity?
Yeah, so I mean, the country that's moving ahead with leaps and bounds is Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is a country, they're obviously facing some very serious internal security and governance challenges right now. But for the last 20 years, there's no country on the continent that has been as deliberate and successful as transitioning from low productivity agriculture toward higher productivity agriculture and industry. And that's really been Ethiopia, and they have pushed ahead with electrification based mostly on a large hydro. And I don't think it's a total coincidence, but they have mostly spurned Western finance for this, because the roadblocks put in their way to build large hydro were so onerous that they just turned to Chinese financiers and Chinese construction. And I think that there's
so the Chinese are financing the Grand Renaissance Dam. That's all Chinese money behind that, or because that's a huge.
I'm not sure the details of that one. But obviously big project.
6,000 megawatts, and also very controversial, given that
absolutely.
They're going to be upstream of Egypt, right? That this is going to be an enormous.
Yeah, and Sudan for sure. That's a controversial project. I don't, just off the top of my head, I don't want to say for sure if it's Chinese finance, but I do know that Gibe 3 was another big dam that they tried to get through the World Bank, couldn't do it. They tried to get it through the African Development Bank, couldn't do it, and they just gave up and went for Chinese finance. And they've been kind of unapologetic about it, which is, we're one of the poorest countries of the world. We need to create jobs for our 100 million people, and we need electricity, and we're going to do it the way that you've done it, which is without apology. So they've definitely made a lot of strides. Still, obviously, a long way to go.
And if I can interrupt, because you remind me of one thing, which is that when it comes to energy issues, but particularly in terms of electricity. And it's one of the points that we make, that Tyson Culver, the director of Juice, and I make, is that countries are going to do, and individuals are going to do whatever they need to do to get the electricity that they need, right? They're not going to, whether it's CO2 issues or politics, they're going to do what's in their interest, because this is the way everyone does that, right? They're going to act in their own self-interest. Is that a fair way to assess what's going on?
Yes, absolutely. Especially within the context of, extreme poverty, people will go to extreme measures to get what they need. This is why you have people walking miles to get firewood every day, right? That's an extreme response to a need. And the responsible governments on the continent are trying to meet the electricity and other energy needs of their population, and trying to do it in a smart, cost-effective way. A lot of countries have made progress on adding generation. They've been able to get projects through, but they haven't quite been able to get the cost down and the reliability better. So even a country like Ghana, which I work on a lot, they've added a lot of generation capacity. By some measures, probably a little bit too much recently, but they're still dealing with extremely high tariff rates. So the industrial tariff is over 20 cents a kilowatt hour, which is very hard to compete internationally if you're paying 20 cents for power. And, most of your competitors are paying less than 10 cents.
Right. And in some cases, far less than that, for especially industrial use. In Iceland, I think the rate was 4 cents, 5 cents, some cases as little as 2 cents. I mean,
Yeah.
This is something on which international trade is directs itself, following low cost energy, but particularly low cost electricity.
That's right. And that's really why the potential for solar is actually really interesting at a large scale, because we are in Africa starting to see some solar get to around 5-6 cents. But again, that 5-6 cents is just within a very narrow band, because the storage isn't there for load following, So again, yes, we want everybody to exploit 6-cent solar if they can get it, but that is just one slice of the pie that they need.
Right. So you mentioned gas earlier, and that's one of the things that I believe I've written about it many times over the last decade, that this fuel is growing, and on an absolute basis is growing faster than any other form of primary energy. But what's interesting to me about what's going on in Africa is these massive offshore gas fields that have been found in offshore Senegal, Mauritania, Tanzania. Is that right?
Mozambique's the big one.
Mozambique's the big one. We're talking about trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. So, but I also know that from the experience in general, a lot of, if there are these offshore discoveries, the vast majority of that gas goes elsewhere, doesn't stay in those countries.
Correct.
Is there a mechanism that those countries can use then that helps make that more of that gas stay home? And you've talked about this, I think, in your a book that you wrote several years ago on, what was it, cash for oil?
Yeah, oil to cash. Yeah,
oil to cash. Is there a similar gas to cash, or is that what? How do those countries make the best use of that gas, both for electrification and development?
Yeah, so there's a couple of components there. One is they obviously need to negotiate hard, so they get as many royalties and profit and as much profit sharing as possible out of that resource. That's cash that would come into the treasury. And then in our book, Oil to Cash, we argue that a portion of that should be given to citizens as a dividend, a little bit like the Alaska model.
Right.
But there is also an electrification component as well, which is that when countries are negotiating, they can ask for some parallel developments so that some of those resources are used for electricity generation at home. And in Mozambique, which is the big gas find that everybody's talking about, the DFC, this new U.S. government agency that we mentioned earlier, they did something I thought was very clever. Is they provided some finance for part of the offshore field to help that get developed for Mozambique. But at the exact same time, they also financed a 400 megawatt power plant onshore in Mozambique, so that Mozambicans will also see some of that electricity at home. And it's not just cash that gets filtered through their government, but actually some direct benefits to the population and to the businesses in that area that need low cost power. So governments can be creative in asking for things and trying to pair investments with other investments to grow the economy, because nobody wants to live in a country where the only productive activity is offshore gas. You need to have onshore activity for people to earn income, and that's where turning gas into electricity or gas into industrial process heat can help to generate jobs and generate income for regular people onshore.
So, what about the broader? We've talked a lot about Africa, but I know that there are a number of LNG to power projects: Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, numerous other ones. So, I mean, what's your view on that growth in the LNG to power market?
So, clearly, a lot of countries, countries across Asia are some of them are in a similar, if not more extreme position than the African nations, which is they've got a very steep increase in electricity demand as people become richer and move into cities and they try to get industry going. Energy demand is going through the roof. They want to exploit cheap sources that may be domestically available, such as solar, but they're also going to need to balance that with other sources. And importing LNG is one of those things that happens to pair quite nicely with intermittent solar. And a lot of countries are taking advantage of that. I think the big markets for the next 20 years are basically all going to be in Asia and Southeast Asia. And so that's really where we're going to watch.
LNG to power is specifically.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's also the big electricity demand jumps are going to be obviously India and China, but also Indonesia, Bangladesh.
Pakistan,
Yeah, these countries are all on steep. They're growing fast, and their populations are getting richer at such a pace that we would expect them to move quickly up that energy ladder. And the population, the government's going to want to meet that demand.
Sure. I have neglected to remind the listeners that my guest is Todd Moss. He's the executive director of the Energy for Growth Hub. You can find him at energyforgrowth.org. And I'm going to ask about spy novels in just a moment. But I wanted to just get back one check back on Africa. Do you have that number in mind in terms of if you wanted to get all of Africans up to that energy minimum that we talked about earlier, how much more generation capacity Africa would need to add?
So
You can
again,
say no, it's okay.
No, I don't have it because you have to break it by each market, and we're talking about 54 countries.
Right.
So we'd have to project it there. I'll tell you one thing that we did do is if we tripled electricity, which will not quite get us there, but tripling is good. It's a good start. If we tripled electricity in Africa on average, and we did it entirely with natural gas, entirely, and nobody's proposing that, maybe it'll be a third, but let's say entirely with natural gas, the additional CO2 emissions is less than 1% of the global total. So Africa is producing so few emissions and consuming so little electricity that it literally does not show up in the global totals. So the takeaway that I get from this is that Africa, the intersection of Africa and climate change is very, very important, but it's mostly about adaptation. It's not about mitigation, because there are so few mitigation benefits to wring out of Africa's power sectors, because they're just not emitting outside of South Africa, really.
Right. That's an interesting point, because it's one of the things on this podcast that has been emerged as a theme. Bjorn Lomborg was on, this is one of his key points, that look, we can spend a whole lot of money on mitigation when actually we should be spending more on adaptation, which I think is a lot of Roger Pilkey Jr.'s work. And then two Irish researchers I had on recently, Coileen Ohashu and Ronan Connolly, their point that we're spending trillions of dollars on a lot of mitigation effort when we're not seeing major CO2 emissions reductions. Well, then where's the best place to spend that money? But let me move on because we're getting closer, right about an hour already. Who is Judd Riker and why should I care?
So I mentioned earlier that I was an accidental diplomat in the State Department. So when I left government, I actually started I wrote an outline for a book about dysfunction in US foreign policy, just about how difficult it is to get things done and all of the infighting, and all of the challenges that our country faces, going, in the next decades. And I decided it would be a really depressing book to write and probably depressing to read. And I thought it would be more fun to illuminate some of these issues in a fun way. So I decided for my own, just for catharsis, to just write a novel about an accidental academic who becomes an accidental diplomat. And he gets thrown into a coup in Mali in West Africa. And he's got 100 hours to reverse this coup. And I thought, oh, this will be a fun exercise. And I wrote the book. And then Mali had a real coup. I don't know if you remember, after Libya fell and all jihadists took over the area of Mali bigger than Texas and set up an Islamic state. And then the French invaded, and the government was overthrown. And I had sent the book to an agent who watches BBC, and he was watching French troops fighting in Timbuktu against jihadists. And he had just had this random book fall in his lap about that same issue. And so he wound up getting a 4-book deal with Penguin. And I wrote 4 Diplo spy thrillers about this kind of nerdy academic in the State Department. And it was, just a ton of fun to write. And I hope people, had fun reading them. I'm working on a domestic political thriller now that I won't reveal at this stage, but hopefully I'll be sharing information about that in the not too distant future.
So, and I have, Judd Riker, you went through that explanation. Judd Riker is your hero, right?
Yeah, he's the protagonist.
And I'm holding up, if you're looking on YouTube, you can see this is the cover of the Ghosts of Havana, which was the 4th book. I downloaded this on my Kindle. I started reading it last night. Well, my other question is, why do all the leads have to have the initials JR? Jack Ryan, Jack Reacher. No, wait a minute. Judd Riker and who is that? Reacher, Jack Reacher.
Yeah, Jack Reacher. I don't know. That's a good question. That's a good question.
Where you just knew you had to have it JR. Was that
J's and K's are very strong letters.
Yes.
And I don't know. I was playing around with it. I've got a really good friend named Judd, and it just seemed like such a awesome, like, retro name that should come back. I don't know where these things come from. But
so would you, if you had your choice, would you be writing spy novels instead of being a policy guy, or what's the real love here if you had your druthers?
I love doing both. I love the idea of using different parts of my brain. And, I segment my day. So I like to wake up really early in the morning when it's really quiet, get my coffee, my laptop. That's when I'm very creative, and I like to write fiction then.
So what's really early?
Between 5 and 6 start.
Okay.
Not ridiculous, but
and
then by
it's about the time I get up. I'm serious. We're up by 6 every morning. My wife's a teacher. We got to get up and get on it.
It's the best time to get things done, right? Yeah. And then by about 8 or 9, I'm tired, because creative writing is actually kind of mentally, I find it tiring. And then I'm ready for the rest of my day. And then I can be a wonk for, 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. So that's how it's worked for me. I love doing both. I'll continue to, do both. If you love what you do, you don't mind getting up and, plowing ahead. And as long as it stays fun, I'll just keep doing it.
And you can find out, energyforgrowthhub.org for the wonk, Todd Moss, toddmossbooks.com for Todd Moss, the author, right?
That's
You
right.
can
That's
also
right.
find them
Check them
on,
out and let me know what you think.
also found them on Amazon. And I thought, yeah, no, it was interesting. I read a long time ago Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana. So I thought,
Uh-huh.
okay, well, I looked at the different books. I thought, okay, well, Graham Greene a long time ago, never been to Havana. So I thought, okay, I'll read this one. So I dove into it last night and found it very fun. At a boy. So just a few more things then,
Yeah.
Todd. Um, who are your heroes?
Who are my all right, so I do have a couple of heroes. I think, my grandfather was my hero. He was a regular guy that just grew up, poor in Chicago and just, did all of the hard things that first generation Americans do to help set up their lives for all of their descendants. So
And
I always
from
think of
from where
him.
from where did he come?
Well, he was born in Chicago, but all of his family came from Russia.
Uh huh.
Um, and he was just one of these great guys that I always just think fondly of. And I can't imagine what he had gone through. Um, and another hero of mine is, there's a human rights lawyer. Um, Her name is Beatrice Mitetwa. She's actually the inspiration for one of the characters in my second book, called Minute Zero. And she's one of these fighters who just combines smarts and courage, and she's in court every day fighting for human rights and democracy in one of the most difficult places in Zimbabwe. And she's a definite hero of mine. And then this won't surprise you. This is also, I've got a lot of African heroes. Um, there's a character, not a character, a person named Nuhu Rabadu. And he was the first, you asked about Nigerian corruption. He was the first chairman of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. And he did his job so well. He got a couple of governors kicked out of office, in jail. He turned down a suitcase with $5 million cash. And I got to know him after he had to flee the country and move to Washington. And he's just one of these people who have grace and wisdom and humility. And I like being around people like that. And so Nuhu Rabadu is definitely one of my heroes to this day. So those are three for you.
Sure. Okay. Well, so you're a writer. What are you reading?
What am I reading? Oh, right now I just started a fantastic book called The Plague Cycle. It sounds grim, and in some ways it is, but beautifully written. It's by Charles Kenny, who also happens to be a good friend of mine. And it's the history of mankind's fight with infectious disease. And at first I was like, oh God, I've got to read my friend's book during a pandemic. This is going to be grim. But it's actually, he's a beautiful writer. The history is incredible. You realize how what we're living through is not such an anomaly for human history. And I was thinking about it, it's almost like, I feel like it's Dr. Anthony Fauci giving me a tour of the London dungeon, because he's got all of these facts, and he kind of loves being kind of macabre and disgusting about what people were going through with lice and leprosy and the Black Plague in Europe. And Charles is half British, half American, but he's got that very kind of British, dry sense of humor, and it comes through in his writing, even about the plague.
And this is the
So
post.
I've really enjoyed it.
This is the post-Trump Fauci, not the not the muzzled Fauci under the Trump administration. The post is.
We love Anthony Fauci no matter when.
He's remarkable. Okay, so last thing, Todd.
Yeah.
Again, my guest, Todd Moss, the executive director of the Energy for Growth Hub, Washington, D.C. think tank, that you can find his work at energyforgrowth.org and toddmossbooks.com. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Um, you know, um, I'm not going to say the children. That would be terribly cliched. But when look, I work every day with young Africans, including many who, you know, virtually every day the internet or the power is going out, and they're still doing such incredible things, even though they live in a place where the infrastructure is holding them back. And I think that the potential for the tens of millions of 20 somethings and teenagers in Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya and Zimbabwe who have so many ideas and so much potential, and we see that if they just get they just get a little bit of a chance, they're doing amazing things. And I think that that human potential is just so tremendous, that that gives me hope that that we're going to solve our energy problems, and by solving our energy problems, we're going to solve so many of the problems that we as mankind face, and we as a country and as a global community face. So I'm actually very optimistic about the future. It's probably out of fashion to say that these days, but I actually think that you know, the next several decades are going to be way better than the past several decades.
I think that's a good way to stop. Good place to stop, rather. Well, great. Well, Todd, thanks. I think you said it well. Unless there's something else you want to add to that, we could have talked about carbon issues and Africa, but I think we touched on those sufficiently, and I don't want to dive too deep into that here, because the CO2 emissions are not their first priority. They're have other priorities in front of that. So
Comes back to trade-offs, right? We all have to make trade-offs about what kinds of things we're gonna what we're gonna do, and what are the costs of certain things that we choose, and what are the alternatives that we have. And I just don't think we should think of people living on the other side of the earth as you know, fundamentally different in making those choices than we are.
good. Okay. Good. Well, we'll stop there.
All
Thanks
right,
again
thank you,
to
Robert.
my guest, Todd Moss, from the Energy for Growth Hub, energyforgrowth.org. You can find him there. Come back next time for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. And before you do that, make sure and give us a 6, 12, 14, 84 stars on your favorite podcast outlet. And until then, see you next time.